Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello, and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we talk about leadership, presentation skills, diversity, and how you show up in order to move ahead in the world and get the recognition that you deserve. Before I go to today's guest, I'd like to invite you to take our free 4-minute assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And that's where you can see where your presentation skills are strong and where perhaps a little bit of support could get you the recognition you deserve and the results that you need. My guest today is Nikki Lanier, who is the founder of the RAARE Collective, which is a way for Black women and white women to work together to advance, to move against racism and inequity. Just a technical note, we were having some technical issues with the internet connection today, so there were a few blips and freezes, but Nikki is so smart and she has so much to say. I didn't want to re-record it. I wanted to get her while I could. So there's a little, just bear with us. You'll get the information. Nikki's official bio is extensive, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of it here, and then you can read the whole thing in the show notes. Nikki Lanier is the CEO of Harper, Slade, which is a racial equity advisory firm focused on helping organizations and communities advance equity for some who need it and equality for all. She's an experienced leader with over 25 years of career achievements that spanned banking, labor and employment law, human resources, and government. She's been a chief human resource officer in private and the public sector in a multitude of disciplines. And she's experienced in managing operations in multiple sites and comprehensive approaches that effectively align human capital priorities with the overall organizational strategy. She's been an executive management committee veteran with the Federal Reserve Bank, Philip Morris USA, Georgia Pacific, and Charter Schools USA, as well as many other. One of the things I wanted to interview Nikki about is her economic, from her Federal Reserve days, her macroeconomic view of racism and how racial inequality affects everybody, no matter what the color of the skin. There's so much more in her bio, but I want to get to the interview. Nikki Lanier was fascinating. Took me pulling some strings to get her, so I'm really glad. Let's go on to the interview with Nikki Lanier. Nikki Lanier, welcome to Speakers Who Get Results.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, you are so busy and you do so many things. I'm really glad that you're giving me your time this afternoon. And our pre-call and the times I've heard you and other times is fascinating. So I have lots of things to ask you. First question before we get into the policy stuff is, if you could interview somebody who's no longer with us, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
So I would have loved to spend time with Jesus and would have loved to interview him, primarily because my work and my orientation around the fundamental human-to-human engagement, how we think about valuing people who are different than we are, and the grace and the love and the presumption of full humanity and the ardent kind of guiding to new epiphanies, new ways to think, new ways to believe, new things to hope for in grace, he was masterful at, in spite of lots of folks who were assuming the worst of him, who questioned his integrity, questioned his impact, questioned whether he was who he said he was, and knowing full well that his destiny was to die. And either because of that or in spite of that, worked to connect with human beings, with humanity in beautifully sincere ways. And so I just would love to spend time asking questions around that level of conviction and commitment and sincerity. And I think everyone should listen to that interview. If I had the opportunity to do, I think that that's something that all people could learn from, irrespective of religious leaning and orientations around religion. I think this idea of attaching to hope and promise and doing so through love is something that our world could stand much more of.
You know, I love the way you talk about that, because I always think about what would it have been like to be him, or to be living there, or to be one of the people around him. And I look at our political situation now in the US and how the establishment is pushing back against uppity people from the lower classes and uppity people from minority groups who want to take their equal place. You know, it's an old pattern and a human pattern. And I'm really not happy that we're in it. So, Nikki, one of the reasons I really wanted to interview you is because I've heard you speak. And when we did our preliminary call, you had a unique take on how to think about the importance of advancing equality and equity. What's the urgency? So please talk to us about that.
Happy to. I'd love to. I think it's important for us to think about racial equity inside of a context other than right thing to do, social justice. Like, it's nice to do. It's hard to attach urgency to that, especially when we recognize that racial equity is kind of de facto disruptive. It is countercultural to our norming, and it is antithetical. It's not how we live. We don't live in a space that embraces the idea that Black and brown people are equally human. Mm-hmm. We just don't. And that's manifested for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so what I know to be true, because of my background with the Federal Reserve and having spent some time studying this with those economists and others, is that the browning of the country, meaning by 2040, America will be decidedly Blacker and browner. Hispanic people and Black people will make up
by
the majority.
2040, you said?
2045.
2045, okay.
Yeah, and so that happens by 2045. And so Black people and Hispanic people will make up the majority in our citizen body. And so what we know by way of monetary policy making, i.e. that which is promulgated by the Federal Reserve, and fiscal policy promulgated by Congress, both of those entities are very reliant on the health of the middle class in order to determine how policy is going to work, right? Mm-hmm. And the instruments and the modality that they rely upon, that they go to help them determine how to think about policymaking, presumes that whomever is the majority in the available workforce and or the majority in the citizen body, at the very least, is represented in the middle class. So, Elizabeth, in this current dispensation time, the middle class is anywhere between $60,000 to $120,000 income earner. And with just that strata, we know that Black and Hispanic households have never been meaningfully represented, ever. And so it's going to be important that in as much as we're becoming the majority, that we also be well represented, at least in middle class, if not beyond. Middle class throughout the middle class, not just kind of button up against it, coming into it at the entry level, but well represented throughout the entire strata. And we also know that the biggest impediment to Black and brown economic mobility is the way we experience racism at work. That's not the world according to Nikki. That's been well studied. And so I see the advancement, the accelerated and amplified activation of Black and brown talent in America's workforce and workplaces as the economic imperative of our lifetime. And we only have 22 years between now and then. So we have to fix that very quickly. And that's why I focus so intently on racial equity within the DEI construct.
What do you say then to those who say, great, I'd love to help, say, white allies, I'd love to help, but I don't know what to do. What can we do? What could someone like me, on paper, I fit a DEI category, but I know that being white gives me advantages that, people don't see my disability. They don't see my difference from the outside. It's completely different. What do you say? What would you say to someone like me who says, okay, I want to help. What can I do?
I have two answers. And so what I would say corporately from inside of an employment context is first recognizing that racial inequity and racism structurally and behaviorally is already in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And so many of us mistakenly, probably wantingly, believe that if we erect enough training programs and if we write the most darling DEI policy, then it just won't come in here, right? Mm-hmm. Inequity, unfairness, inequality, racism, it just won't come in if we erect enough stuff around it. And to that, I say it's already there because mm-hmm. it's in the United States. It's in the lifeblood of how we've been groomed, and it's part of our inheritance as human beings, and certainly human beings in the United States. And it's been so calcified, it's almost unrecognizable because it's just so insidious. It's just a part of how we think, act, talk, walk, vote, everything about how we collide with other human beings. So it's already there. So that's the first thing I would say, kind of corporately, just it's important to first recognize that it is already there. And what organizations can then do is think about the remediation of that differently. It's different when you think about preventing something versus remediating something. So, right?
And by remediating, for our international listeners, basically that means fixing it, doing something about it, changing the balance. Yeah. What do you mean by then doing something to fix the problem?
Yeah. So recognizing that because it's already here, the way that we train, the way that we set policy, the way that we think about what the Black and brown experience must be at work, with an understanding that your darker employees, of course, are experiencing racial inequity. Of course, they're experiencing racism. Of course, they're experiencing marginalization, being muted or silenced at work, being stifled, being stereotyped. Of course they are. That, like, recognizing that that's in the play, that's already at play, then the employer can start looking at ways to unearth that. Let me find out where that's happening, not if, where, and then address it. Put policy in place to make sure that we're capturing how that's manifested, how that feels, when and where it shows up, so that we can work our policy statements and our training statements and our cultural integrity as mm-hmm. a corporation around that kind of norming versus believing, well, it's not even in here because we did a 2-hour training, so we're good, right?
Yeah, right.
And I think the latter is where a lot of others are. Now, I would say, my second answer to your question is in our individual capacity, the most important thing that we can do, especially white people who are interested in being useful in the racial equity advancing mm-hmm. space, is to learn about what has uniquely happened to people of color. I mean, the structures, the laws, the impediments, the history of policy, all that has basically for the entirety of the United States history, we have lived under various laws policy statements, practices that have fundamentally required that white people see Black and brown people as less than human, as subhuman, as not deserving of the full right to access rights. Right. So that's kind of how, if you think, that's why Jim Crow worked. That's why slavery worked. That's why redlining worked. That's why we don't have water in some of our Black and brown communities. That's why we have police brutality more often than not with Black and brown people. That's so the reason why those can live is only, in my opinion, because we have a belief system that Black and brown people aren't really human, don't deserve more, are victims of their own choices and circumstances. And that's an easy place to go if you don't know about the laws that have given rise and the policies that have given rise to keeping Black and brown people inside of a very tight box, so that there are fewer options that have always been able to be exercised. And most white people believe, well, you've had the same opportunities, you've had the same options as I've had. Historically, there's no evidence that that's anything close to that. Mm-hmm. But most of us don't know it because we don't teach it in the schools, right? So in an environment where CRT is banned about for political whatever, and we don't really want to, we don't teach it. We hear about it a little bit for Black History Month, but we don't teach it. And that's important. So learning that is important.
Okay. So my next question being then, learning about it. And, I'm sure people, well-meaning allies, think that they understand. And we know that we can't really know for sure. What can we do? What can we actually do to just on the ground? I mean, thinking globally, acting locally. What can we actually do within our own sphere of influence?
Yeah, I appreciate the push on this, Elizabeth, but I'm kind of going to go back to what I just said. I think it's important that before the doing is manifest, before we focus on the doing, that we first orient ourselves around who we are vis-a-vis this doctrine. This idea of racial equity sounds great. It sounds like I'll just be nice to Black people, or if I see somebody being called the N-word, I'll say something, or if there is a conversation that is happening in my neighborhood that seems to be focused on those people, and I cannot believe that I'm going to intercede. And okay, so all of that is a way, but I think because we have so much, I keep saying calcified, but so much to kind of chip away at how hardened this soil is around the idea of Black and brown being equal to white and deserving of fixing what happened to us by way of equity. That's how I define equity. So not only are we presumed to be equal, at the very least equal, but it's also presumed that what happened to us, such that we have never been presumed to be equal, will now be fixed, right? From a policy standpoint. So wrapping our heads around that takes time. It takes time. It takes community of understanding. It takes choosing to be well-read, to live inside of experiences that you haven't before, to worship inside of worship places that you haven't before, to go to grocery stores in Black and brown communities to see exactly what we're asked to buy, what the quality of the things to.
I have been there. Yes.
Yeah. It's insane. And so just really thinking about, how do I spend time understanding what is now the lifestyle and the lived experience of people who have only known generationally for centuries a narrative inside of their home country that says, you're not equal to me. And so that takes time. So what I don't want to rush is asking people to quickly advance racial equity without really understanding racial inequity. Because what then happens, and you've mentioned this, is that at best, what you can become is a supporter of me, or someone who looks like me, or someone who wants to help me out. I am not necessarily looking to build allies among white people on racial equity. I'm looking for leadership, right?
Okay.
comes from understanding that racism, this ideology, this doctrine, this mindset, this belief system has robbed you too. So it affects me more acutely, certainly, but no one has escaped the venom of racism. White people too. It has robbed you from being able to operate in a more fuller economy. It has robbed you from being able to engage with people like me on the street without the noise of presuming, oh gosh, what's the narrative on this one? What's the right? And we don't want to admit that we do that, but we all do it. But racism has taught us that that's what you're supposed to do. And we don't know how to do anything differently. And it's also robbed us of the ability to imagine a world without it, which is probably the most damaging reality of racism. We are all losing, and increasingly so as we move into the demographic majority. If we can't become a part of the full American dream and access through our efforts and through our preparedness and through our educational attainment and our professional acumen, if we can't also access the fundamentals of how the economy works, because the narrative is louder than my preparedness, we all lose. The economy loses, GDP loses, our G7 footing loses, our monetary policy frameworks lose, our fiscal policy frameworks lose, and we'll be living in apartheid. So that's an untenable state.
Okay,
so I want you to be an ally. I want you to lead. And so I take the time to lead.
Okay, lead how?
So that's where, so you will need help.
I'm trying, you have this amazing, Nikki, I'm trying to give you an opening to talk about your amazing movement. You're starting a movement. It's called RAARE. Yes. I want to hear about it. We're talking about it. I want to advertise it. Tell us what this is.
So so this is for white women specifically, and for inclined white women who are interested and curious about, want to know more of how to become racial equity leaders in every space they hold. The RAARE Woman Collective, it stands for Radical Action Advancing Racial Equity. So there's 2 A's, RAARE. And it is a collective program coaching suite curated by Black women for white women, so that white women can become confident and clear and convicted, understanding of how to identify racism when I see it, or racial inequity when I see it, what to do about it, how to correct it and redirect it, while also not completely damaging the relationships that I'm holding. So what we want is for women to be in this space, in their homes, in their workplaces, and in community. And these are all very precious relationships. So relationships with your spouses and your spouse and your family and your kids and your coworkers and your neighbors and whomever. We don't want you to blow those relationships up. But to the extent that some of those may be the architects for how you see racial inequity unfolding in your life, and there's a mindset that you need to kind of help redirect, we want to show you how to do that gracefully, with love, in the same way that Jesus would, and focusing on real outcomes that reset the sentiment that gives rise to racial inequity, not necessarily the manifestation of the thing. So RAARE Woman Collective launches in Louisville, Kentucky. It's 3 days, and we launch with a live event at the historic Brown Hotel in Louisville. And so it's 3 days of coaching and communing and coalescing and amazing connection making, all designed toward radically advancing racial equity. We're inviting 200 women from all over the country who are coming to Louisville to start this work. And there's just lots and lots in store. I'd love to talk. Do I have time to talk about kind of how the days will unfold?
Well, no, I think what we'll do is we'll send people to the website, and for those of you who are listening, this will take place in November 2023. The first one will take place in November 2023. So if you're listening to this podcast afterwards, because you never know with podcasts, if you're listening to afterwards, still go look at the link on the website. I'm sure this is going to be the first of many of these, building this very important coalition. For our listeners, those who are listening, there are people around the world. So can we expand the view for a second that racial inequity in America is the great wound of our history, it's the great bleeding wound of our history. If you are listening to this from another country and you see inequity around you, what does taking a leadership stance against inequity, what would that look like? Talk to me about concepts.
Yeah. So conceptually, deciding, well, first of all, it actually starts with a belief system.
Okay.
So taking a leadership role and advancing racial equity is not unlike taking a leadership role in any transformational undertaking, in any disruptive undertaking. It first requires a belief that it can happen and it can happen through you. So on racial equity, as an example, whether you're in the United States or not, believing that we can create a world where racism just can't live must be an unmovable fact for you. Like you have to know that and be unmoved on that. So leading starts with a belief system that is true. Then it starts with a decision that I'm going to start with me. So wherever I am, this idea of inequity cannot also be. So United States, wherever you are, if you're in your home, if you're at a graduation party, if you're at the physician's office or at the grocery store, if I am there, racism cannot also be here, or inequity can also be here. And so the belief and then the decision and then the investment. So you have to invest in yourself to learn about the structures and the impediments and the ways that racial inequity have lived in your home country or the country where you find yourself now, the city, wherever, the continent where what has that all looked like historically, and what have I never had the chance to learn that I must know in order to be a credible source of leadership in the space?
So if we've been studying this for some time, many of us have,
Yep.
I know I cannot know everything of what it is like to be in the world with a Black or brown or face or, Asian eyes. I know I cannot know that, but I've tried. So knowing that I cannot know it, what's the next step? What can I actually do? Is there a concrete action? I know I can't know it completely, but just studying doesn't change anything, except maybe my attitude. So how can I, if I want to help, how can I then do something that's going to make a difference for somebody else instead of having it be just about my education?
Well, but your education is important because as you're doing that, it conveys the sincerity and the authenticity. But in terms of doing, on the topic of racial equity, things like making decisions to buy Black and brown for everything, making a decision to amplify Black and brown voices. As an example, and I'm not suggesting that you do this, Elizabeth, but as an example, in the name of furthering racial equity, you might say your podcast for the next 3 years will only feature Black and brown voices. That's equity. It feels exclusive. It feels because it's supposed to, right? It's supposed to remedial in terms of what has happened. So what hasn't been activated and amplified will absolutely be activated and amplified on my watch, right? So that's one way to do it. To focus on conversations with loved ones and asking questions, prompting the questions. So how many of you in our family, why have we never really talked about racial equity before? What do you guys think about it? How do we have those kinds of conversations? So being like the spearhead of new thinking and awareness within the circles in which you run, huge. Being able to practice and it's actually in some ways a safer place to start the navigation of those conversations, just because it's family and like they love you. And so that's one way to do it. And then thinking about paying attention to where else do I see the presumption that only the white voice or the white face or the white thinking or the white norms to be validated in the space that I can have influence over. Just thinking about that. An example of that would be we have a university well, there's several of these, but one of the universities I'm thinking about in Kentucky that really is desperate to get more Black and brown student enrollment, but they don't have any Black and brown pictures of anyone on their walls. There's no acknowledgement of the nuances and the idiosyncrasy. Like there's no Black people on the boards. There's no Black professors. And I don't think it's hard for people to pay attention to that unless you pause to reflect on that, or you have someone like you and other amazing people who are awakening to a sensitivity around this, who can say, hey, I know what your issue is. I know you didn't ask me. Let me tell you what I think is the problem, versus Nikki having to do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so those are just some examples, just thinking about what could I do to make sure that Black and brown economic mobility happens. And what we get subject to more often than not is the stereotypes and the microaggressions and like those kinds of things that when we talk about them, it's hard to have them received in a way that doesn't feel like it's whining. And then also, I can't stress enough the importance of education. So if you feel like you're fairly well educated on the laws and structures, then I would say pick 5 people for the remaining of this year to make sure that they are in your circle that are equally invested and equally oriented around at least what you know. And then, of course, tell folks about the RAARE Woman Collective.
Yes, right. Right. Well, what I love about the idea of the RAARE Woman Collective is that it then gives you a group to work with. Certainly, I know for working with women, that having your group and your community to do that with you is good. If you are someone who wants to be an ally, like me, who makes an effort for it to do this, how can we reach out without being perceived as being condescending? I think one of the reasons a lot of people don't reach out because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing.
This is a great question, Elizabeth, and it is fundamental to why I created RAARE to begin with. And it is a question that a lot of my white sisters grapple with. And it's a fair one. Now, here's the deal. The reality is I kind of don't know. And there really probably won't be, I can't guarantee that there'll be instances where you won't get challenged around that because, again, historically, there has been this, what feels like what people call like the white savior dynamic that I think many white women are trying to not fall into. But it feels fairly easy to find yourself in that way, even with the most sincere and authentic desire. And I think there's one way to kind of get out of that, to help blunt the sting of that, is to become educated on what specifically happened. I mean, I can't stress that enough. And I'm not talking about like reading autobiographies about Black people who have done great things. I'm talking about actually taking it to statute, government, city government, ordinance, federal policy, GI, things like GI Bill, Social Security, how Black people were exempted for that for years. GI Bill can't be that redlining, how that worked. What were the lingering effects of Jim Crow and sharecropping, the Black people's relationship with banking, when the Freedmen's Bureau, what is all of that? Understanding that, because white saviorism, or what I think what tends to get tripped up is that when white people bring their social norm and their understanding of how Black people ought to fix themselves, or their very top line view on how to get yourself out of your own rut, or how to fix the own rut. It sometimes feels like that. And then it's received as, a white savior, right? So that's one thing. The other thing, in fairness, is because I feel so deeply that this is not about allyship, this is about leadership, and that I want white women to feel equally empowered to be mad at racism in the same way that I am. Even if you're not impacted as directly as I am, it doesn't mean that you're not impacted. So you got a right to be mad at it too. And when you find something that you are attached to, that you're singularly kind of frustrated with and angry about, not because of what it's doing to Nikki, but because in your own right, then you attach a different kind of approach to that. But if it's about helping me out as allied to me, then it feels like, well, it always has to be in deference to me. It always has to be checked over by me. It always has to be evaluated before you trot it out to make sure it's right. And so I think that just understanding how to reorient the way that we sit our brain and thinking about leading of racial equity in tandem, Black women, white women moving this way, not Black women doing this, Black and white women doing this thing, right? But we're marching for it together. I think that that's an important reset of the norming around how to be useful as racial equity leaders.
One other thing I will say is to our wonderful listeners is if you are in a position, if you're within an organization, if you're in a position to hire or promote, pay attention to the pipeline. Pay attention to recruiting people of color. And if they don't walk in with the degree and the skills, help them train, help them learn, help groom people for leadership positions. One of the sayings from years ago, Michelle Obama said it recently, but this has been saying along for years, is if you get through the door, turn around and hold it open for the next person. But we have to make sure that the next person, that there is a next person there. So if you're in a position to make an effort to reach outside the easy circles and look for someone who would be interesting, who would be an interesting candidate or an interesting board member with ideas, and there are groups where you can find. A friend of mine worked in a law office. She wasn't a lawyer herself, and they were hiring a new partner. And she said, "Did you even look at the Black Lawyers Association in town?" And her boss said, "The what? Yeah, is there such a thing? Make an effort and look and make an effort to find the people who will bring the diverse voices."
Yeah, that's absolutely important. And realizing that is what it will take. You have to step outside of your life.
Yes.
Most white people have to step outside of your life
Yep.
to experience and to collide with and to have engagement with people who are different from you. That's definitely important. But it's also important to recognize what environment are Black and brown people coming into. Because I will tell you, I've probably had 18 different jobs during my career before I went out on my own. And I'd say 17 of them were fairly inhospitable. And not in ridiculous ways, just the norming of how society works. Like they just don't contemplate the way that Black and brown people walk and talk and sit and stand, all the things, the way that we laugh, how we express ourselves. We tend to be much more, and all of this feels threatening and unprofessional and abhorrent, right? And so if your environment can't contemplate how I show up, because even with that, what I also know about myself is that I'm brilliant. And that I'm super smart and impactful, and I know strategy, and I can carry, right? So, I mean, I know a lot about the law and HR and macro. I know a lot about things that can help an organization move forward. And I'm also wrapped in Black norming. And if you've not had any experience with Black norming prior to coming to work, or in your lived experience, how you grew up, the neighborhoods, your Boy and Girl Scout troops, who your parents took you out to dinner with, and you've just not had regular collisions with Black and brown people until you get to work, Nikki is going to be extraordinarily difficult for you to navigate. Not because of me. That's not that I need a mentor. It's just that you're not accustomed to how I show up because you've never seen me really on a day-to-day basis. So that's important too.
Well, and that's something that I think your RAARE Collective will help with, is spending 3 days together learning about each other. Would be, it's when you see someone as a person instead of the stereotype, that can make a huge difference. Nikki Lanier, this has been fascinating. I think I'm going to have to bring you back a year from now and say, okay, where are we? What's happening? And get the update. I'll put information about the RAARE Collective and how you can participate in the show notes. And thank you so much for taking time out from your very busy day to be a guest on Speakers Who Get Results.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Well, it's been a delight. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. If you enjoyed this conversation, please tell your friends, share it, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That's the one that people count. And in the meantime, this has been Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman. I'll see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.